Jessica, I'm so thrilled that you are with us because I've been hearing about you from multiple different people. And I'm absolutely fascinated how you are leading the way in helping brands and organizations navigate Africa. Now, a lot of organizations, they sometimes underestimate the complexity of Africa, the 54 countries, the fact that it has completely different histories and ethnicities and cultures and tribes and languages. How do you go about overcoming that sort of stereotype where some people approach sort of market access to Africa as this homogenous continent and not quite understanding actually the nuanced approach that it takes?
Thanks, Fazana. That's a great question. I think the first thing is just being bold and just informing people, international brands, look, this is the situation and across multiple countries. So we always say, we can't really do PR just for Africa. We specialize mostly on English speaking Africa. If we had a brief come through, which was only Francophone Africa, we wouldn't attempt to do it by ourselves. We would find someone on the ground who has that experience, and maybe we would collaborate with them or we would pass the work on to them. So I think it's being honest and understanding what the market is. But I think that, in the defense of a lot of international brands, a lot of like heads of comms, heads of marketing, they're probably still stuck in the Live Aid era of, do they know it's Christmas? This kind of like Oxfam charity lens of starving children across a big homogenous continent. And that's the kind of impression that the global media has had and continues to push in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's a sort of a re-education process and actually bringing people on that journey of actually, this is what's happening on the continent. And, Nigeria is different to Kenya, is different to South Africa, different to Morocco, different to Egypt, etc. So I think it's just sort of accepting that people have homogenized ideas and then unpicking them. And that's the kind of slow process.
Jessica, what I'm going to do is add a link. One of my favorite videos on TED is by a Nigerian novelist. And she talks about the inequity of storytelling and how she came from Nigeria, from a middle-class family, and she landed in London and became a celebrated novelist. But people just couldn't get their head around how well-educated and that she came from a middle-class background because they had this one vision that if you're from Nigeria or indeed any country in Africa, then, you must come from a rural background, uneducated, and you don't have that class complexity that they're used to. And so she actually spoke about this in a really powerful, compelling TED Talk, which I'd love, Doug, if we can share the link, because I think it's one of the most viewed TED Talks on the website.
Is that Chimamanda?
Yes.
That was TEDx Houston, I think 2011, 2012. So
yeah,
my former colleague,
Jason
Njoku, was also part of that TEDx Houston event.
Yeah,
she's right. Chimamanda's a fabulous advocate for all things, I guess, Nigeria and Africa in terms of intellect, in terms of culture, in terms of creativity, in terms of intellectual robustness and plenty more. Like I don't want to do a disservice to her by just trying to capture her in those very, very basic terms. But yeah, that makes sense.
Is that basic? You coined emotional intelligence. We don't coin the phrase, but you use the term emotional intelligence, I think, to describe this. It sounds like awareness, overcoming ignorance, emotional intelligence. How does that weigh in? Because I conjure up the images of empathy when I hear emotional intelligence.
I think empathy, not so much, but it's actually taking the time and being patient to actually understand that the market and markets you're operating in, and then adjusting how you do business accordingly. And I guess it's that sort of emotional intelligence, business intelligence. If I'd been to Harvard or Stanford, I'm sure that there would be a better term to summarize that. But it's what I'd call emotional intelligence in terms of not just assuming everybody's exactly like you, not assuming that how people do business is the same as you, not assuming that how journalists do business is the same way of doing business as you as well. And so it's having that time and being able to understand and reflect on how different markets and different cultures do business and engage. That's why the emotional intelligence is definitely required.
So what I'm hearing there is it's not about making people in Africa love your brand. It's about making a brand that people in Africa will love.
100% yes, but I think it's also the brand saying what's the so what story to people in Africa. And the brand might do really well in Nigeria, but it might not do so well in Ghana. It might not do so well in Kenya. And one of the things that I think has been prevalent over the years is sometimes when dealing with international brands is trying to get them to understand that just because they're coming from the outside, it doesn't necessarily mean that a Nigerian or a Kenyan or Ghanaian or Tanzanian or Rwandan journalist is going to write about you just because, that smacks of kind of old school colonialism, which is still, prominent on the continent. But I guess our job as PRs, storytellers, brand advocates is to make sure that we kind of actually find out what that so what is and adjust and tailor our messages for those markets.
When there are some people who are looking for some market access, they often think about accessing countries in Africa, thinking about the country that they're based in. So if they're based in London, for instance, they would think about the channels that they're familiar with, and they will use the channels in a way that's familiar to them, and not actually understanding that different channels in different countries are used in different ways. And there is a preference for perhaps one or the other. For instance, when I travel in the Middle East, they love WhatsApps, and there's so much business that's done on WhatsApp, and whereas perhaps more formality of sort of emails is less so. So Jessica, what advice would you give to people about what you've learned about the way that different channels are approached and how you see working in the UK versus working across countries in Africa?
Well, I'll answer that, and then I have a question for you, Farzana. So. Africa is a mobile first continent. So you have to go where your kind of audiences congregate. So our audiences congregate on WhatsApp. When Doug and I were speaking the other day, he was like, the Americans and North Americans don't really use WhatsApp because most...
I get texts.
Text,
I
right?
WhatsApp Farzana because I have to.
Yeah, I mean, if you text me, I'll just ignore you.
Yeah. It's very odd. It's very peculiar to get a text message these days, right? Because we operate on WhatsApp.
Texts me. Yeah.
And I guess in North America and in Europe, a lot of people, like a huge amount of people, have an iPhone. An iPhone is extraordinarily expensive piece of equipment. Africa really is an Android first country. So even if I met someone who said that they were building an app for anything in any African country, but it was predominantly focused on iOS, I would know that they're not serious about Africa, because the percentiles of who actually has an iPhone are teeny tiny. I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it would be way less than 10% of people that have an iPhone. So iOS is just not, it doesn't scale as much as Android. So you have to build for the market. So again, like we congregate on WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp group with almost every single client. My biggest deal I've ever done was done on WhatsApp. I think that the African tech space in particular is still growing. It's getting bigger, but still relatively small. Really and truly, there's not anyone that I couldn't find on WhatsApp within 2 WhatsApps. As in, ask someone to introduce me, will be in a group. I can find them on WhatsApp, and that's a means of doing business. The same with journalists as well. Yeah, we do send email pitches, but we're more than comfortable sending WhatsApp follow-ups. Now, Farzana, I think you probably pitch more UK-based journalists than I do. How do you think that a UK-based journalist would feel if you just slid into their WhatsApp DMs?
I think I'll get abused.
Yeah, and they will go on Twitter or X or Blue or whatever people are using these days, and they'll start saying, they'll see it as you're invading their privacy.
Yeah.
So it's just a different platform. You have to congregate where the market is, and we congregate on WhatsApp.
If I'm expanding into a global brand, by that point, I've built principles, I've built values for my company. We live and breathe, especially if you're the CEO, you live and breathe those. But now introducing my brand to Africa, I'm not going to amend my principles and my values. Do I first look at the local culture and make sure that this fits my brand? Or like a chameleon, do I understand how my brand and my principles would apply here?
So I think you actually have to monitor and spend time in the market. That's the main thing. It's understanding, if it would be odd to launch a product without understanding the market. But, there are some brands that would necessarily, if they were going after the top 1% or top 2% of the market, they might actually come into contact with, say, a lot of diasporans. The African diaspora is huge. So they actually might base a lot of their value judgments on the Africans that they know within the diaspora. However, that might not translate to actually what's happening on the ground. So you have to adapt the brand. And you know, I would look at how international brands do it. You know, look how Coca-Cola advertises in Nigeria. Look how
Right.
Zoho advertises. Look how all the other brands advertise, and then see how those models are adapted. You know, I see kind of like Guinness adverts. Like Guinness has a massive following. Like it's a big brand in Nigeria, especially. They don't use the same adverts as you would see in Ireland. You know, their brand strategy is modified and specifically for that market because you have to speak to your end users.
And I'm not necessarily trying to be African. In fact, I can leverage the fact that my brand is exotic and from somewhere else, and that in and of itself can be celebrated.
100%. And, you know, you should leverage on your global brand. You know, Africans still, you know, wherever they are, they're still, we all cover it, wherever we are. We cover international well-known brands. You know, we cover Apple, we cover Coca-Cola. You know, we all understand and recognize them, but we would probably all react in a different way if we saw a Pepsi advert in Spanish, right? And we're not Spanish. Like, so we understand the kind of culture and nuances. And I think that's the important thing for international brands to understand, is that cultural nuance is just as important as that kind of global brand equity. And it takes smart marketers and smart communicators in order to modify and adapt accordingly.
So, Jessica, if a brand wanted to really think about accessing Africa, would you advise that they focus on a particular region first?
Yes.
Like, for instance, okay, and so which region would it be? East, West, South Africa?
That depends on where they actually have a footprint and what they're actually willing to do. You can't just go and own Africa from day one. You can't go into all 54 countries. So you would probably see where there's a product market fit. So it goes back to products before the kind of brand and the communicating in terms of market entry. And also, do you have people on the ground? One of the issues I've noticed a lot over the last 10 years is people will, you know, international brands were like, yeah, we're going to go and launch in Nigeria. They've never been to Nigeria. They don't have any Nigerians on the ground. They don't really understand the market differences. Or, you know, they might send a European, you know, member of staff to launch the brand, and that person is there for 6 days. And then they expect to kind of own Nigeria and sort of 200 million people in terms of a so-called captive audience. That's really not possible. So I think it's actually being operational and having people on the ground first before then trying to then do the branding and the marketing. But I would have thought that that's the case for most countries. It's not necessarily specific to Africa.
Yeah, I mean, usually if you go to, for instance, the UK, people would naturally initially perhaps think, let me start off in London. If people, for instance, would go to, and indeed, American companies, when they're looking to go to Europe, they would start off perhaps in the UK because they'll feel some sort of cultural affinity to it.
Yeah.
Language, you know, would be one. For instance, if they want to go to sort of, you know, Middle East, they may start off with Dubai because, you know, they feel there's a lot of expats there. So that's kind of what I was trying to gauge.
Got it.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And I think so stability, so market stability, currency stability. A lot of African markets have sometimes sort of volatile currency exchanges. So that could wipe out your profits as well. Time zones are different. So for example, at most, there's only ever 1 hour difference between the UK and Nigeria, for example. Kenya, I think it's up to 3 hours, depending on you know, UK time differences as well. You know, ease of doing business. There are all those kind of factors that are important, but I think having a network on the ground and actually having people who will give you an honest understanding of actually what's happening in the market. But language, time zone, currency, and political stability, I would say, are very, very like key, absolutely key, unless you have a high appetite for risk.
Yeah, and what's the media sort of ecosystem like there? So, for instance, you know, are there sort of very well regarded, trusted Pan-African networks that you tend to work with quite a lot? Do you sort of layer that with obviously these sort of in-country sort of media outlets? And then also, are there Western media outlets that are consumed there as well? I imagine you probably have Francophone, you know, sort of like sort of UK, the US, you probably have Chinese. So it must be quite a fragmented media landscape.
Fragmented, yes. I guess Wimbart specifically works in sort of tech, corporate B2B. So we really understand the media landscape very well. There's, you know, let's take the tech space. There are some in-country tech blogs and tech outlets. Then there's some really like large tech focused publishing houses. Like there's Tech Cabal is sort of Pan-African, started in Nigeria, but they've scaled to Kenya, they've scaled to South Africa, they now have French speaking. So it's interesting to see the evolution of some of the publishing houses, digital first, and then they have in terms of their monetization models, events. They do digital video production. So they are evolving in a similar way as, say, Western media outlets have as well. Then obviously, because of, Africa is a huge continent, and lots of business and opportunity and activities happening, Reuters has a large bureau, Bloomberg has a large bureau, Financial Times, CNN, BBC. I mean, it's interesting how media is consumed. So, for example, in the UK, I would never watch CNN particularly. It's not a common media platform that a Brits watch. I would say that Brits probably only really watch it when they're abroad.
That's so true.
Yeah. Nigeria, it's like the go-to international media brand. Like CNN Africa is one of the biggest sort of media targets for us. And interestingly, one of their, they have this incredible reporter called Larry Madowo, who's like one of their roving reporters, who started off as a tech journalist. And he's grown. I believe he went to BBC and then he's at CNN. He does CNN Global now. Amazing. And I think that it's great that some of the international outlets are actually using local talent to report on local markets. And then it gives them a platform to go global as well.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Jessica.